We are live. Hey, this evening, post show last week, Kaiser and I got to discussing some things, and this is not a part two of North Carolina. North Carolina may come up, but that's not the emphasis tonight. Tonight's just sort of a bit of wandering and delineating where he's at, where I'm at, what we're trying to achieve when we talk about the right wing, when we talk about biospirit, when we talk about a grand narrative or a unifying narrative. There were glimpses of that last week. You saw us getting off track a little bit. Well, I won't even call it off track. There were some opportunity areas that we wanted to shine a light on, and so whether that was Heinlein and talk about Starship Troopers or whatever, but we did talk afterwards and say, maybe this was still a little bit too opaque for some of the folks that were generous enough to listen. So we wanted to dig into those ideas, and this sort of be, um, us walking around talking about some of these ideas. But yeah, jump in, throw up questions, and we'll hit those two. And we're just kind of gonna wander and see where the little light takes us, see where the bouncing ball goes to. And with that, Kaiser, how's your week been?
It has been interesting. For starters, we had William Wolfe on the Green Tavern, who is a great patriot, good friend
That's a
of.
big deal.
Oh yeah, yeah, it was big, and it became a big deal because I can be a little bit spicy on Twitter, and there are a lot of people who do not like William Wolfe, and they used me as a weapon to try and say that because he would even bother to speak to me, because we had some common ground, even though he's different than I am, he has very different, he has different views, but that we were able to just simply talk, that was enough for them to say, you have to denounce me, you have to throw me out, you have to remove me from everything.
Yep.
And William Wolfe, who is a good man, did not do that. And I had even messaged him, hey man, I know like this sucks, and maybe you didn't see some of these posts that they're digging up that I made. If you need to disavow me, you can. And his
Right.
response was just like, I hope that you know that I'm not that kind. Like it insults me that you think I'm that kind of person. Where it's like he
That's
knows
kind of
that
awesome.
it was great to see.
Yeah.
Where he is just not willing to throw me out simply because, maybe I'm a little more extreme than he is. Maybe I tread in different waters than he does. But we agree enough. We both love America. We're both patriots. He's worked for the DoD. I served in the DoD. We have some bonds here, and he's a good enough man where he was not going to just throw me out simply because he was getting a little bit of pressure.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's we've seen it again and again, especially with religious guys, whether it was Wilson versus Webben, or all the stuff that's gone on with the Stone Choir guys and so on. Now, never mind. I was going to caveat that, but why? Anybody with two brain cells understands what the natural caveats are when you host somebody and whatever. So
Yeah,
it's
but it is good to
you.
see that it's not, throwing under the bus, even though I honestly I wouldn't fault him that much for it. I had a bit of a patriot go off moment. What can I say? We all have a few of those. But
Fair enough.
but yeah, if you wanted to talk narratives, I guess which would you want to start with? We can go with narratives or we can talk about biospirit. I'm happy to do either.
Um, how about we start with the story? It was really bugging me today, and I think it's
Okay.
actually going to set the tone for where we're headed tonight, and sort of why distinctions are important and why we're drawing some of these distinctions. Okay, so there I was. I finished a long day of working my sheep today, and what we do with the sheep is that we raise them for slaughter, we raise them for sale, and was like, oh man, okay, good. We're all wrapped up, and I was like, doggone it, I forgot to pull out any meat for tonight. Most of our meat's frozen, and so it's like I forgot to pull meat out to thaw it or whatever. And kept running through my head almost immediately when I did that was um, some guy some third worlder, and I can't remember who it was, but I remember the quote running along on X last year, and it being, well, Americans are going to have to get used to the idea that it's not going to be meat every night anymore. And I think that's an incredibly profound statement to say out in the open, because Americans, Europeans in general, Americans in particular, we did get used to eating beef and we got used to eating meat almost every night. And we went through, near millennia of that not being the case. If you look at the peasants' diets back in various portions of the medieval times, it was not great. But we continued on it, and we did get to the point where we eat meat nearly every day, or at least have the opportunity to. Um, and so, for somebody to come from another country and tell us that now we're supposed to have that idea of, well, maybe we just can't have meat every night because the country can't support it. No, the country could support it when we had a particular way of operating. And so to tie that into a grand narrative, um, I think it runs alongside culture. And so I think culture is generally the the overwhelming display of whatever our grand narrative is. And I think that oftentimes we can have micro narratives within the grand narrative. And my example for that would be when I say my dad was German, I'm always joking around and saying I'm a half breed because I'm the first. I'm the first. The first one that's not completely German. My dad decided to get all spicy as a teenager and marry outside of his race. He married a colonial English girl, and so now I've got English and German running through me. But where I'm going with that is that if you'd asked my dad what he was, it's like, well, I'm an American. In the house, he would say, yeah, we're German. Out in public, he's an American. And that went on, of course, with his military career or whatever. And so, what causes that? What is it we're seeking in that? And then, frankly, we can get into what is our great narrative, but in my mind right now, we're sort of discussing like what is the theory of it and what is it we're trying to say is accomplished within a grand narrative.
Yeah, I can get into a bit of that. So if you're talking national narratives, right? I think the easiest example that you can see from this is with the Romans, right? So you had the Aeneid, you had Virgil, and you had this grand story of their origins, of how Rome was founded. And so in their narrative, you had the Trojan War wrapped up into this, where you have, the general gist of the Iliad, but these survivors of Troy escape the destruction of it and through a process find themselves out in, Italy. And after that, you have over a couple generations of these survivors, you have Romulus and Remus born, and they're raised by a wolf. They drink wolf milk, and they are brought up. They grow up. They end up becoming these great leaders. They end up coming together, but then they have this disagreement where one of them is going to go found a city on this set of hills, another is going to find it on another set of hills. Romulus and Remus. Romulus ends up surviving. Remus ends up dying. That's why it's called Rome. So you have this kind of idea of like, this is where our origin is. We come out of this line of Trojans who are our founder. They built this city state over here. You have this succession of kings, and then you have eras too to the Romans, right? So that's kind of like their primordial one. That would be, if you were to translate it over to America, kind of like that idea of the pilgrims coming over here and and finding what is now in the current narrative, this idea of they were there for religious liberty. That would be their start of it. But what you see also through Rome is this changing of narratives too. If you look at some of its history, where over time these things start to change, where like Before, if you look at the contemporary view of Jamestown, of Plymouth, of these things at the era where people were writing of these, they still had a narrative, but it was a very different one. If you look at like John Winthrop and what he's talking about, for example, when he's talking Plymouth specifically, he talks about Plymouth as a city on a hill where he essentially wants to build a theocracy out in the wilderness, away from all the rest of society, from these corrupting influences, where they can have total control over it, and they can build the most pious, pure Christian people out of it. That is their narrative.
It seems like there's some interesting parallels there with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young.
Yeah, no, oh, absolutely there are. But it's interesting because if you ask most people, and I frequently find people repeating this narrative, that what the Pilgrims actually sought was religious liberty and freedoms, and as just this broad view. And you're talking about it's this is the other part of the narrative, is that it doesn't actually have to be totally grounded in reality. You do need some level of facts to it, but it's so obviously contradictory, this general notion where I guarantee you, if you ask most people about the Pilgrims, they would tell you they were just trying to escape persecution, they wanted religious liberty. But you look at what they actually did, and Quakers, for example, there were Quakers who were executed for having differences of views that showed up in their colonies. They were extremely strict. It was a theocracy that they wanted. They were the descendants of the Pilgrims in particular. They actually, the funniest thing about this religious freedom narrative is that they actually were in a land of religious freedom, where they had left England, many of them, and gone to the Netherlands, where the Netherlands had a much higher degree of religious tolerance there. But they actually left that specifically because they saw it as a corruptive influence on their children, where they would become more like the people of the Netherlands, and they did not want to see that out of their successive generations. So like, we're going to remove you from everything and go build this. So
if you a quick jump in there, guys, if you have not read Baxter or Knox or man, in any of the Puritans, even R.C. Sproul, up until 20 years ago, R.C. Sproul and some of his writings on the Westminster Confessions, this is some pretty intense stuff. Now, the three forms of unity there on the continent within the Reformed world, it's a little bit different in emphasis, but the Puritans and the Reformed folks, this is no joke. When it is exactly what he's saying, in that the idea is, they were searching for religious freedom. Well, the religious freedom they wanted was to build the kingdom of heaven on earth, and they would do it by hook, crook, and hanging gallows if necessary. So,
yeah, exactly. Like it was freedom for their particular group to be able to be autonomous. Like, that's what you could actually take from it. And when you look again at this idea of the narrative, you need to understand that, like, it is so divorced from the historical reality of what people see about America if you just ask the average person about what they think of it. And it can persist entirely divorced. However, there are times where I think reality does come in and kind of brings a hammer to it. And I think that that is what we have seen to this kind of narrative, particularly on the right, where the narrative, since I would argue about the 60s is when the latest American narrative has formed. Yes. Where you have this idea where America is, yeah, go ahead.
Woodstock is an easy totem.
Yes.
It's not that Woodstock actually had power in itself, but it was an outgrowth.
Yeah, well, if you ask anyone that's around that age, they would all say that they went to Woodstock, even though something like maybe like 10,000 actual tickets were sold. The same with like all of them went to Vietnam. But it is because that actually speaks to the power that it had, where everyone wanted to claim some kind of participation in these things that was in that generation. And maybe they even in some way think that they did, even when they actually didn't go, because most of the people who say they went probably didn't actually go.
It was real in my mind.
Yeah. Well, that's gets to something that's very poignant, because these things don't actually have to exist or have actually happened. But if it's real in your mind, that kind of narrative does actually capture people. And I don't think that that's a
So
good thing. It's not prescriptive, it is descriptive when I say this.
what's the I think it's obvious, but I really want to hammer down what's the utility of this? Why is this something that we should be aware of?
Well, I think it's something that you should be aware of because it's something that will always exist. You always, every society, every group of people has some kind of narrative that they're raised up in, where you have this idea of like, what is the purpose, like what is the world, what are the things that you're going up around, how do you understand life around you, how do you navigate through these things. Narratives and things like this give this to you. You know, there's it's I'm not trying to reduce it, but Christianity is itself a narrative. It is purposefully, and when you really get into it, I think that there's a profound thing where in Genesis it says that the world is spoken into existence, that God said these
Yeah.
things, and that there's a reason why we have the Bible as scripture as something that is written. It gives you this narrative, even in scripture, of here's creation, here's all these things, here's where you originate from, here's these different tribes, here's Noah, here's Noah's sons, here's where they originated, and then here's you know, Abraham. And this is that stretch that goes through. And we see all groups do this. The
Yeah.
Saxons, who are my particular fixation, have their own narrative, and they were very, very invested in keeping this narrative. Where you had Alfred the Great, just shortly after he defeats the great heathen army, commissions the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it is a historical record, but there is a lot of myth that you could add to it, and it's
Sure.
clear what they see from themselves. Because if you read the Saxon Chronicle, it's this chronological dating, and it starts with Christ. It starts with the different things that were going on in the Roman Empire, and then where the narrative really kicks off, where it kicks into here are our people, is Hengist and Horsa coming over in 449 AD. They bring this group of German mercenaries to go fight the Picts on the side of the Romano-Britons, and then it's this narrative. Here's how we conquered. Here's how we built Wessex. Here's East Anglia. Here's all of these different kingdoms that we formed as we came here. That narrative is something that will be present with everyone. And right now, the narrative that is trying to be formed is almost like a global one, but it only really picks up in European and American peoples, which is this idea that we're all, you know, one people, we're all just trying to come together, build that. These
Because
narratives,
we don't want to go anywhere else. I mean,
yeah,
from a Grug perspective, it's why would we want to leave a better standard of living and go live elsewhere in a culture that's not us and that doesn't offer us anything?
yeah. And
So
as far as, yeah, but as far as these narratives go too, like they're important because it is going to shape also your politics, your culture, all of these things. It shapes churches too, where churches
yes,
now are very different, and it's because they have adopted these ideas where you try to talk about the Ordo Amoris, for example, something that was very well understood in Christian circles, and you start to bring out some of these things that have been very well understood, that you can find writings of Augustine, of, you know, it's in Thomism, it's in all of these different aspects of Christianity, and it goes quite strongly until the modern era. And in the modern era,
yeah.
now if you apply a lot of these principles that were once very commonly understood, there's a lot of churches where you would get excommunicated out of them. You would be kicked out, you would be removed simply for trying to uphold these things, because that narrative that I think mostly came around in the 1960s, of this idea that, you know, we're all one race, the human race, everything's just
Yes.
about ideas and adopting ideas, this kind of blank slatism that
Well,
permeated.
You and Arthur seem to be reading from the same sheet of music, because he had said down in the chat, he said that we've gotten the BS narrative since 1990 at least about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it's all a simulacrum of equality.
Yeah, I mean that's the best way to put it, especially simulacrum, because it's not real. It's not something that,
Right.
if you look at any number of statistics, if you just observe things, like there's very clearly not this actual equality that really exists. Like you do have,
Mhm.
and I believe it's Aristotle or Plato. I'm blanking on which one, but either way, there's this idea of a natural aristocracy, and then there's also natural slaves. There are people who are simply going to be in these positions and in these things that have in their nature to be like this. And I think you see that reflected too, where there are people that exist, and you have to grapple with this, where it doesn't matter what education you provided them, what things you gave them, they're simply going to be people who they would never be, a rocket scientist. The idea that
Mhm.
like anyone could just be a rocket scientist if they were just put into the right environment, that's
Right.
simply not the case. You were, and this also again gets into something that should be understood, which is that there are sort of natural ways that you were made. And what I also hammer in specifically is that you were designed a specific way, made a specific way. This is another narrative that you get that needs to be really examined, which is that most people will say it's a matter of luck, that where you were born or where you came out of, you were simply lucky to be an American. No, I would posit that I was meant to be an American. Even if
Yeah.
you aren't a Christian, it's very obvious because I belong to a very specific lineage and bloodline that stretches back to creation that led me to this point. It was
Mhm.
not a matter of luck. It's not like I was in some massive gumball machine and someone like spun a quarter and then, oh, out comes you. And then you end up here. That's just what happened. Like your spirit just randomly went into these things, or it's like a lottery where wherever you're born is just a pure lottery ticket of where you're at. No, you have a mother and a father, you have all of these things, and that disconnection specifically of disconnecting you from the entirety of your past, just saying, okay, well, you're here, is something that is a part of this new narrative where you're just kind of exist. We are more disconnected, I think, from the past than we've probably ever been. And you see this very clearly if you look at just the writings that I look at of the founding
Right.
era, where I spend the most time in. One of my favorite letters ever is John Quincy Adams writing to John Adams. And he just says that he's talking to his dad, and he's saying, I am having a really hard time proportioning my playtime and my studies. I meant to be 3.5 volumes through the entirety of English history. I'm only 3 volumes deep. He wrote this when he was 10, and he's asking his dad for advice on how to better proportion these things. He had a far greater understanding of where he came from, of all of these things, than the vast majority of people that are around right now, despite the vastly greater access to information that you have. It's an interesting contradiction in that aspect. But thank
Yeah,
you
it
for
is.
letting me rant heavily in monologue. But go ahead,
No,
please.
it's good, and I'm going to pick up narrative here in a second because I do think it's important. Just as we're talking about a grand narrative, we have to talk about competing narratives. But just to blank through something interesting, and he says, nature is inherently unequal, but we aren't meant to apply this to humans. And I think if I'm hearing what he's saying, I think that is an important point. That yeah, even with everything we're saying about natural hierarchies and all that, there is this transcendence that we have to operate within, and so this is why there is grace for the child that comes out with mental, excuse me, not mental deformities, but what am I thinking? Mental deficiencies. This is why we don't just kill the weak among us, but we do try to find value in particular humans um, throughout and amongst their life, even while we're recognizing hierarchy. And I think
Yeah,
that's part of. I think that is part of the higher image of God that plays out in our lives.
yeah, and it is both, right? There's
Right.
this idea that there's a certain way that you were supposed to treat human beings, right? That you have this shared humanity, and that should apply. And I would never really say that like you should treat other human beings as though they are not human beings. Everyone is still human, and there's a certain dignity that is to be given to other human beings. However, there's this level of equality that you do have, But there is also this inequality that does exist, that does run through things, and that also has to be recognized. Where, for
Yeah.
example, the way you treat people that are leaders, and you understand this, leaders are meant to bear more responsibility than those who are followers. That's just one example. They have a greater degree of what decisions they are able to take, and they are able to have people do things that they have a degree of authority to them where they can tell people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, and that person ought to follow that. You can have both. You can have an understanding of equality of man, and you can have an understanding that we also are unequal, and we should acknowledge that and operate around that too, because it's reflective of reality, which means that God made it to be that way.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, you find it throughout Proverbs, throughout the Psalms, but then I'm also thinking the Apostle Paul. Some chose to be eunuchs, and some were made eunuchs, and so just this idea that there is more going on outside of us than necessarily uh, we can choose or even intentionally participate in. So Midwit likewise he throws up here. He says, "From one man he made all nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." This is Acts 17:26, to which Midwit follows on saying, "The Apostle Paul, in other words, apparently believed that where each person finds themselves in time and space is not at all a matter of chance." And I think that's right. I think also the idea you see nation. I don't want to say it's supra scripture. It's not as if it's sitting above it, but at no point within scripture is nation denied. And more than that, it is continued to be presented as a reality. And so whether we're talking Genesis or Revelation or anywhere in between, except for one specific passage wherein they're talking about the spiritual state of man, except for that passage, which we're all aware of because it's always crammed down everybody's throat, nation is just taken for granted. It's something that got established. It's something that we are all participating in as soon as we're born. And frankly, even prior to us having been born. The Apostle Paul again writes about this stuff in the book of Romans, and how what blessing is it then to be a Jew? Well, it's much in every way. So let me explain to you how these guys were blessed and how they ignored their blessings, and how that blessing was for them was they were particularly participating. And don't confuse this. I'm using dispensation just because I think it's a good term, even though I'm not a dispensationalist. But in this particular dispensation, in this particular time within God's interaction with humanity, the Jews were on the receiving end of both um, paradise and punishment. And so paradise was the opportunity, punishment was the reward for often their lack of engagement um, in paradise. But this is all again within a particular time within Scripture, and so the God of gods has been acting since the beginning as the single great religion to draw all humanity under him. But I guess we're getting a little bit off topic.
If I could bring it back, Midwit did actually hit something that I think makes his name a complete misnomer, because
Right.
this is actually one of the most important things that, particularly like if you find yourself on the right, whatever that may be, there's something that Orwell said that I found really relevant, which is that he diagnosed like the nationalists of his day as always living in a kind of alt history, where they would find these particular points in time where they would say everything went wrong, and if only this had happened, if only that had happened. And he's speaking particularly of the Spanish in this regard, because he had actually fought for the leftists during the Spanish Civil War. But
Yes, he did. You know who supported the Spanish during the
yeah, it
Spanish Civil
was.
War?
Yeah, you're talking about the British guy of Mine Were of Trouble.
Oh,
Um,
well, sure. So Peter Kreft, I think, was
yes, Peter Kraft.
Yeah. So yes, him. But I was also just going to say, in spirit, Tolkien was supporting Franco. So,
Yeah, and in material, so was Henry Ford, because Henry Ford gave over
mm,
10,000 vehicles for free, essentially, to the nationalists during that time. But that's another aside. What I was getting at with that is he points particularly to like the Spanish Armada and the defeat of the Spanish Armada is where they say, if only this hadn't happened. And you find people quite often can end up living in this almost like fantasy world where they want to you find this, I would say, most heavily with people who have like very monarchist leanings. This is a trap that they often fall into. And there's some truth to like monarchy being a natural form of human government. But a lot of them will decide that because monarchies have seemingly gone the way, they're more or less extinct in the West, what vestiges exist are very sad compared to what they used to be. But they will often just say we ought to have this thing that we used to have, and then they will construct these ideologies and these thoughts and these ideas around these things, around monarchies, and then they will just live in that world. I've met people who said like the only thing that matters is restoring a monarchy, and then they have no idea how to actually do it. They have this idea, this kernel of truth to them, but then they end up living in this fabricated reality because they're living in the past and they're desperate to have lived in a different time than the one that they were appointed to live in. And that's why, like, I think it's worthwhile to say, like, I thank God for having placed me in times as interesting as these.
yeah.
As much as I love the Revolutionary War in our older histories, as much as I love the antebellum South, for example, and I'll defend them all day, I am very glad that I was born in the time I was because that was the time I was meant to be in. I was not meant to be in any other time than this one. And there's a lot that I
So
can do in this time. Yeah, go ahead. I'm
there,
monologuing quite a bit.
no, you're good. You're good. There is an interesting conversation, and it kind of depends on the day, which way we swing, because there is the question of theological imperatives and distinctives. But I've got different Amish buddies, and most of the time, when it all washes out, we're sort of the idea that, well, God made me Amish, so I should stay Amish, and God made you English, so you should stay English. That's not the whole truth. In the Amish church in general, let me caveat it and say if you've dealt with one Amish church, you've dealt with one Amish church, and so the Amish church in general, if you come to them crying and saying, "Look, I need to change my life," most of them are gonna let you in, and so on and so forth. But in general, it is sort of this idea that we both have different crosses to bear is so dramatic and on the verge of sacrilege, I think. But we have different paths that we're walking, and we ought to think very deeply before we rush off to be Amish, before we rush off to be English, before we rush off to be monarchists. Even though I will tell you, in a perfect world, I think that's how it would go. Ultimately, that's where we will go. When Christ reigns as the King. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah. No,
Uh,
and I get what you mean with that. Like I would say that like there's a to bring it into the anime that I named myself after. There's
which
a
I guess
great
I should watch at some point.
you should. It is this also speaks to narratives because I think stories teach people far better than if you just sat down and explained things as they actually are. There's a reason why Christ spoke in parables, but that's a whole other aside. But when you there's a great bit in this show, Legend of the Galactic Heroes, where you have on one side my character who is he's the leader of essentially an autocracy, and that's what he grew up under, and that's what he understood, and that's how it stood for nigh on hundreds of years. And there's this other guy who there's this grand galactic war between these two parties, and the other side is essentially a democratic republic. And the other guy had grown up under this for centuries. And there's a point where the empire has defeated, more or less beaten them in a major conflict. And he sits down aside from the other main protagonist who comes from this other society. And he tries to get him to join him because he sees this guy as extremely valuable, as the greatest general that they had. And now that he's more or less got them into a place where they're he has the upper hand. Why don't you come over? I would make you one of my top leaders. You would be like someone by my side. And what this other character, Yang Wenli, says to him is, we grew up drinking different water. The water,
Yes.
I've heard that the water that you grew up around is what you ought to drink, and that what works for one might not work for another. And so I grew up knowing nothing but democratic republican idealism of individualism of liberty. And so I could not go to your autocracy regardless of whether you had a better system or not than I had. And I think like that, again, it's a cartoon, but it hits something that I think is very real. And this is also where it gets into, I think, if you want to segue into biospirit, um, I think that's very true of that too, where, for example, I think Americans naturally, by the lineage that we have and by our circumstances of how we came around, this kind of Republican government on some levels speaks to us in a way that is extremely natural to who we are and how we were founded and what we have understood since the time that people first came to these shores. And so it's what we know, it's what we have. And there's something to be said where I don't think everyone, in the same way that I think you would understand this, it was an absurdity to try to bring democracy to Afghanistan, to try to get these, yeah, right. I mean, do you want to talk about some, were you are you able to talk about any of your experiences?
um, let's see. In the most general way, and I think we're all aware of this, but you will just hear two OIF guys speaking right now that this was, to maybe even a lesser degree, but certainly to at least an equal degree, it was as absurd to go into the greater Middle East and expect them to act uh, within Western mores as it was for the Seventh Cavalry or anybody else to go into tribal lands and expect them to act the same way as Westerners. There are reasons. There are reasons that we found the actions of the Iroquois and the Comanches as ribald and shocking as we did, and those reasons had to do with how we how we how we viewed Christ, the different things that our peoples had already been through throughout their history, and um, I think that's a good. See, it's hard to talk about because we could get bogged down, and there's no such thing as democracy over there. The warlord is a warlord because he is acting in power, but that power is according to his family and according to whatever various tribal influences are operating at the time. So, are we starting to get a convoluted picture here? Because that's all we ever had when we were operating over there. And so, I think it's clear as mud, and I think that's probably as good as it should be. Does
I
that
think
work?
what I well, it's interesting because I would say that they have a much more natural system where it is very much bloodline based. It's based around who's actually related to you. Would you agree?
Yes. So the issue I want to draw out in that though is whereas on its highest note, even within Persian systems and certainly within European systems, uh, on its highest and most ideal note, you could be expected to act a particular way because you were a part of such and such family. Whereas in the Middle East and different areas in the world, it didn't necessarily matter how you acted because you were a part of such and such family.
That is an interesting contradiction that I would also say is as clear as mud, but I think I get what you're getting at with it.
The very fact that you were part of a certain family in the greater Middle East allowed you to act without without repercussion.
Essentially, because you had this specific line that you were
Yes.
attached to, you got to do what you want. I think you see a lot of that, for example, with like the Saudi princes and the things that they get up to over
A
there.
hundred, a hundred, 110%. Um, the check in there is supposed to be Islam, but it doesn't really check once you get to the higher levels. Now, you can make that argument too in regards to European families, but I I think it's a fairly strong argument to say that a lot of this stuff is relatively post French Revolution, where you see sort of this disbandment of expectations for royal families. Now, maybe there is something going on in Islam that, or excuse me, not in Islam, but in the Middle East that I'm unaware of. Maybe they've had some sort of cognate to the French Revolution, uh, but I don't really care because I saw how it played out, and it's the fact that when you're over there, the worst thing you can do, the shockingly worst thing you can do, is take your Skittles or take part of your MRE and give it to the tiny kid
Oh yeah,
because
that is one of the yeah. Go ahead, yeah,
right
go ahead. I know exactly what you're
as
talking about.
yes, as soon as your back is turned, that little kid is gonna get the crap stomped out of him, and there is no semblance of okay, to paint it really broad and kind of mean, there's no semblance of honor or of a greater uh, of a greater moral narrative amongst the people of the Middle East within the lower classes.
Yeah, they
That was
have
my
a kind
experience.
of it's almost like it's ingrained in them that this is just how things are and it's okay in a
Yes.
way that is utterly repugnant and abhorrent to us. And I think that this is also a good point to get into where the again, like going to the Saxons, who I have spent a lot of time on, they had even under as far as Europeans went, they had a much greater degree of responsibility and accountability that they expected out of people, and also a greater treatment of the lower classes than even most of the other European groups had, where the vast
So
majority of their population was yeomen who were free landholding peoples, where you had expectations out of your noble classes, where the thanes, who were their equivalent of like knights or lords, if you didn't serve in the military when you were obliged to, by law, you lost your noble status and you lost all your lands. The king was elected. Now, they could only elect out of the specific bloodlines and the ties to it. You had to have some degree of legitimacy, but they were
right,
allowed within the core elite to choose who actually became king. For the most part, it was respecting that king's appointed successor, but there were times where it deviated away from the patrilineal function, where Alfred is the best example of this. The son of the king was not chosen because he was terrible. Alfred was chosen instead. There's this idea, the ideas that you see reflected in them, you see reflected in us now. And it's also why you cannot just transplant people and expect everyone to be able to adopt the same narratives, the same ideas, the same functions just by taking them from one place and putting them into another. It's something that's been built up over millennia to be like
right.
this.
Yeah, and so I do want to come back to this because this is, you know, going for impact on biospirit. The last period though that I want to put on narrative and why narrative is important to just sort of tie it all together. It moves a group of people and it gives them background, and why we have to be ever dutiful and ever aware of what our greater narrative is because we if we want a grand narrative and if we want to operate within one, we have to watch not only from those who would tear that narrative down. And so an easy this is third world. This is guys coming over, not just Ellis Island, but guys coming over in the last 10 years and saying they're as American as us because they believe in freedom of religion, which means erecting a 40-foot monkey statue or whatever. Um, the other part, though, is that you have to be aware because when that narrative gets shifted by those within your own group, as advertised, if you do not know what narrative it is that you're participating in, then you get quote unquote right wingers saying that, well, maybe it's not that kind of religion, but it was freedom of religion, and we can all participate in this, and that this nation was made for everybody. And so those subtle tweaks, if you're not holding on to what this nation was and how it was built, they will get changed. And so Kaiser's already talked about things getting changed. And when it comes to a narrative, for you to participate in it, you have to know it and you have to be aware of the tweaks. It's the same idea of, who used to handle counterfeiting? Was that the Treasury itself,
Yeah, yeah, it
or
was the
was it the
Treasury Department.
FBI? I can't.
No,
Okay.
the FBI came, I believe, after that, but it was Treasury agents initially under the
Yeah.
Department of Treasury. FBI
Who
took it
knows?
over.
Who knows if this story is true? But it rings true, and there's a true principle within there, and it's the idea of, how they figured out whether a bill was counterfeit or not. How did they know all those bills that were being counterfeited and weren't correct?
I don't know. How did they?
It's because they knew what the one legitimate bill looked like. They didn't have to worry about making sure that they knew what all the other counterfeit bills looked like. All they had to do is make sure that they knew what the one legitimate bill looked like. And so, know what our narrative is. Know that it is a group of English colonials that came over here to settle, to grow, to enrich an area.
Oh, I guess I'm host. Oh, I thought I was going to host alone for a second. You were right in the
Yeah,
middle
I'm
of
not sure
something
what
great.
happened there.
Go ahead, please. You were really cooking
That's
there.
fine. Well, it was just the idea of know what our narrative is, and we'll leave it at that because yeah, we'll jump into biospirit because I
There,
do think these start building on each other,
there is
and
something to be
so
said, though, really quickly about what
yeah,
you're hitting at with that counterfeiting in that bill, and particularly like when you understand the Treasury Department in that aspect of it. It is a specific class and a specific group of people who are doing that. You don't expect that out of absolutely everyone to understand it. They simply go along and they understand and have trust that their bills are real and that they're not counterfeited because there's a specific group of people who are actually meant to do that. And so it's the same way when you're looking at narratives. You have a specific group of people within society who are to steward this and then to bestow it to other people to keep these things alive in them. It's a degree of your appointed leaders, it's your artists, it's your writers, it's your thinkers, it's your historians. And that doesn't make them better necessarily than other people. They have a specific role and a specific function to play in the same way that a farmer has a function. And it is on those people to be able to give that narrative to everyone else. It's something that I'm really hoping that I can get something out there because one of my goals right now that's very big is I want to be able to make a set of historical fiction around the Revolutionary War in the Southern campaign, particularly in North Carolina, where I am hitting on some of these things that resonate with people. You get something similar out of the Patriot, but the Patriot twists the narrative significantly. And I want to give a bit of historical fiction, a story to people where I am talking about the things that happen there and I'm doing it in a way that I think hits it more accurately and gives them through that an understanding of who they are, where they came from, these things. Maybe I will succeed, maybe I will not. It is something that I'm trying to do. And it's something that I think we need more people to be able to do.
yeah. The Patriot's a funny movie. It's got it has its hokiness, but it's also the overarching sweep. The overarching sweep is fun too. So
Yeah, how could you
yeah,
hate the Patriot? And it is funny that it was made by a foreigner, but it is still a great
right.
movie.
Yeah, it is. So I think there is just as a quick aside. I think it's I think there was probably truth to that old trope that the foreigner wanted to be an American. And I think we have proof that the issue is that the second and third generation don't want to be American. Second and third generation in particular want to be Indian or want to be um, Middle Eastern or whatever it is. And so we saw it, well, frankly, we even saw that with the Italians and the Irish in particular, between the various Europeans that came over. Are you
Yeah, it
American? That's not entirely fair, especially with the Italians, because the Italians, for whatever reason, did have a fair bit in the military that were American, but there was also a national grievance with those two.
Yeah, I can definitely see that there was one, and it's also something to be said about like how different a group is and how long it takes to sort of get them to coalesce. And this is where we can really tie into biospirit, where again I'm going back to the Saxon kingdoms, where they were these petty kingdoms that had been separated by whether you were a West Saxon, an East Anglian, a Northumbrian. But when you had the invasion of the Vikings, who, even though they came from a fairly similar land, were so different in their spirit that it showed these people that they were should be in one. And Alfred has this dream of England that would eventually form and coalesce. But however, you had Vikings that had settled there, that had been there. You had Danelaw as their land. You had the Britons who were there, who did not go away and actually make up a good portion of the English genetic base. You have all of these different groups that were there that form who the Englishman is today. And there's a similar regard where America is doing a very similar thing. However, it is on a longer, we're newer to it, and we're also dealing with different things, very different people. But I think what you're seeing and where the narrative and also where the biospirit and all these things are kind of coalescing into is where we are really questioning what is an American and who is an American. And there's something to be said where, even though I do have founding stock heritage, I can trace all the way back to the 1600s. And there are people that are here that I get along with quite well, who are, Polish, but and haven't been their family. The closest that they have is like the 1880s. But there's something to be said where he and I are understanding that we are vastly more similar. And the fact that he has been around this culture for this amount of time has integrated him enough to where he is now an American. He does have a different lineage, and he needs to understand that. If you were to then go say, oh, well, I'm Polish and I'm therefore exactly the same as that, that would actually be wrong. It's the recognition that he has been a part of this and that he is a part of this same group and that he has been grafted into that, that then makes him be able to coalesce as an American. And when you have these things, when you realize that the fact that we have different people coming in, people that are very, very different from us. Again, you have people that worship monkey god statues that have done that for
Right.
thousands of years, which is completely alien, and they are building them in our lands. And the second you see that, it shows you that me, even though, he's Polish, we have a lot more in common and a lot more similarities. And there's actually very little that is different from us. The way I think, if I could define biospirit and where I think you have these two parts of it, is there is a biological element. There is something where you have different ethnic groups and different nations. However, there is a spirit as well, in the sense that it is not entirely biological. The fact that you have these different groups coming over forces this kind of mixture in this ethnogenesis, where what is an American starts to coalesce more, and we start to understand it more as these storied people with a heritage to us. And it's also, I think, very clear that people that are too different from that don't end up coming in. I mean, the easiest example is, despite the fact that Ireland was ruled by England for, centuries upon centuries, the Irish never became English. They might have
Yeah,
even spoken English, but they have a very different story to very different people. Despite how similar they are, that never came together. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's very
mhm,
clear that even people that you might think ought to be, oh, why did they never just coalesce? Well, sometimes people, even with some differences, just never are able to actually form as a cohesive people. And that
sure.
should be
Well,
some, yeah, go ahead.
and part of that's part of why it's not completely it's not completely externalities. It's not completely because one group grew up in the snow and the other one didn't. Now that's a big part of it, but that's not completely the issue, because like you're saying right now, we have guys that are growing up along the same meridian within the same general climates and so on. And so it's not solely what's going on the outside that will produce these people, but there is something where the Irish were operating more or less along the same external conditions as what would ultimately become the English. And like you said, there was never this actual assimilation. There's always been a grievance there, to the point that never mind. That's a story for another time.
Well, if we could, and sometimes I think it's unfair to say the Irish are, black, but this is actually something, because they're not. They are Europeans. But I don't know how, if this is, I hope this isn't too much for you. I land you in hot water like
Are
I'm landing
they?
other people. But there is something with Jefferson where he does talk about how the grievances and the things that have happened with among blacks and the natural differences that have happened,
Right.
acknowledging that there has been wrongdoing that has been done to this group of people, but that history of it, that fact that these things have happened, are going to make it so we are never going to coalesce as one people. And I think if you're looking at this, and even if you like, I think it's almost utterly undeniable that they are a different group of people than the broader, European descent Americans are. They have their own culture,
So
their own way of living, their own way of acting. Yeah, go ahead.
that's more or less what I was going to ask you. That to some degree, are the Irish even Europeans?
They are. No, they're Europeans, but what's really, I don't want to be too harsh on the Irish because there are things that I do
Yeah,
like
well,
about them.
and I didn't necessarily mean that as an insult, but it is that sort of, did they grow out of the same ethnos and the same spirit?
Well, the bigger question is, did the English even? Because I think that the
Well,
English are significantly different than the rest of continental Europe.
yes and no. Or I don't. Let me try not to get too far ahead of my skis right now. I think the English are different-ish, but I still don't think the English are as different. Certainly not from the Northern Germans. Uh, Sorry, let me walk back. I think there's more similarities between the English and the Northern Germans, or perhaps even the Danes or whomever, than there is, uh, excuse me, not the Danes, but the Dutch, than there is between the Irish and continental Europe. That would be more or less the basis of my
I get what
argument.
you're saying with that, and here's where I think you can go with it. And with respect to the Irish, because I don't, well, Northern Irish, which is to say Scots
Right.
Irish, which is to say not Irish at all, is part of my line. But the rest of Ireland, which is very different from Ulster, and the reason why they were never able to coalesce is
Mm-hmm.
because of that difference in their history, where you can
Right.
say, yes, they are European in their biology. I think that's undeniable. But in the spirit that they have, because they have this grievance based history for the most part, where you will speak to these people, and even though there's a lot of Irish that I like, they will be very quick to talk about how much they absolutely hate the English. Look at all these evil things that have been done to them. Look at all of this, where they have a history. And when they hold to that narrative, that gives them more similarities to a lot of the non-Europeans than it does to Europeans. Because I think what you have, and
Right.
where you even have them kind of like identifying more heavily with these colonized groups, is because when you are someone who is sort of like a colonized, a you could say defeated people, a narrative that very quickly forms is around the idea that your people did nothing wrong, or did that there was nothing that they did improperly, or they never should have lost, but they did. And there's this kind of victimhood that comes about where you are unable to acknowledge, you start to lose your own people's agency and their own destiny, because you have now decided that this other group of people who have beaten you, because they beat you, because you don't want to accept that your people lost, you simply say, we did absolutely nothing wrong, we never should have, but these people were just so awful and then they took everything from us. And that's where you start to get into this, you could say, third worldism, where I think
Yeah.
you see Americans starting to kind of adopt this, where particularly in the American context, I think there's a lot of people who recognize that a lot of things have gone wrong here, but they don't want to acknowledge that in large part this was a country that was owned by our forefathers, and a lot of our own people are responsible for what happened, why things are the way they are. They made decisions that led us to here. And I think when you can actually own that we have
Yeah.
screwed up and we have made mistakes and we did things that we probably shouldn't have, and we need to correct that, that actually gives you a higher degree of agency to your own narrative and to your own people, rather than just simply say everything that went wrong was just wrong, everything was bad. And even someone said
And th-
cough boomers, but to put foist everything off onto this other generation purely, I think is also a mistake.
right.
I don't think it's good to dwell too much on that. As much as you can talk a lot about how much the boomers screwed up, there's things that we're screwing up now and that every generation is screwing up. And the only thing you can really do is try to fix your own, correct the
Well,
problem.
and to get spicier than that, this is sort of the invisible line that separates the people that notice a rootless and cosmopolitan tribe versus people that are defeated by a rootless and
Yes,
cosmopolitan tribe.
100%. And that is something that needs to go through, because the rootless and cosmopolitan tribe is what so many people, that's all they ever want to talk about. They don't want to talk about
Right.
anything else. They think if you're not talking enough about that, then you're doing something wrong, or maybe you actually work for them, or all of these other things. But when you have this understanding, what I would say is that we essentially have chosen this state of things, where we decided to essentially give up and say, we're going to now make it so that we no longer work on these lines, where we are no longer tribal. And the only group of people that adopted that are heritage Americans. Every other group decided not to. And here's where you can also see a lot of the essence of it. Like, all it comes down to is that them working as a tribe and working more along these lines to capture things, to do things, to help their particular people over others, then led them to greater degrees of power and positions. And it's something that I think is very well explained, because you can also see Indians doing this, where Indians, if you look at like how much of the hotel industry is owned by Indians, well, they worked to capture that. They did that intentionally. They hired their co-ethnics.
Right.
They made sure that that
Well, that's
happened.
I do think it is an interesting comparison, and to be glib about it, I think the idea of Indians being the Timu edition of Jews is pretty solid.
Yeah, that's actually probably one of the best ways to describe it. But it all it is like when you have a group of people that come into a land that is foreign to them, what will happen,
So
and this is what, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was actually just thinking, going back 20 minutes ago to when we were talking about the Middle East or whatever, that is one of the interesting aspects of Semitic ideas and Semitic orthopraxy is that it is this adoption of the family, not of merit, um, not of something in and of itself, but because it's the family gets it. The family gets to take part, the family gets to enjoy, and the family gets elevated.
Yeah,
And
and they elevate it to the point where they will, for example, hide crimes or other things, or help them out, or have blood feuds just purely because
right.
it's family. And that's where, like, that's why I
Yes.
want to maintain the Western ideas, because even though we can value family, we don't necessarily think that we should then avoid consequences from ill behavior from our own family members if it harms the wider society. We have
Yes.
this kind of idea of it that people think is something that everyone has. Very few people truly have that.
Right. Yeah, it's oh man. Like it's such a stupid thing, but it's almost a concept you can't get past. And I'm recognizing your avatar and all that. When you see a group of people like the Japanese, it sticks out in your mind. Now they're all culture. That sounds like such a stupid DEI thing to say. All cultures have their dark side. Well, okay, I mean, yeah, but at the same time, cutting guys' dicks off and putting it in their mouth after you killed them in World War II, that's kind of intense. That's not something that Europeans ran around doing. However, the heights of Japanese culture are also very impressive, and it is that idea of what is the greater nation beyond just who what my bloodline is.
Yeah, and well, that's also to be said, because I've spent a lot of time in Japan, and there's a lot that I respect about the Japanese. I like them quite a bit. They have a lot of things that are objectively better that they do than us. Like, for example, um, I never saw trash lying anywhere the entire time I was there. Everyone is conscientious about things like that. Nobody wants to disturb anyone else's peace. If you're on a train, for example, nobody talks above like a hushed whisper, because they recognize that
Yep.
there are some people who actually sleep on trains, which is, I still can't wrap my mind around this, but they somehow are able to sleep on trains and then wake up at the correct stop. It's a really weird phenomenon, but there's so many things where they're super conscientious about the rest of society. I got to see elementary school kids walking to school completely unattended, and they were both capable of getting themselves to school and doing so safely. Whereas here, in many cities across America, the idea of sending your children out to go walk to school, there's a lot of places where bad things will happen to them that simply will not happen to them. However, it goes back to that same thing where I could never live in Japan. I could never transplant myself there because there's too many differences. They are a very different
Yep.
group of people. Um, they have a lot that I find admirable. I think they're a very intelligent, very cultured group, but it is very different. And it's
Yes.
different in a way that I prefer. I prefer living in the South, around very high crime areas where all these future doctors and lawyers and scholars are getting up to some funny business. But there's something about living like that, even though that I prefer over living in an extremely safe environment like Japan, because it would just simply be too different.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes back to that whole idea of biosphere, and I want to stress that we're not talking about personal preference. I think it's far too easy to dismiss that. What we're talking about is how individual nations operate in unison, intended or not, intended or not, where this can be the general expectation of them. This is why you can have a game like Age of Empires, and you can have the various classes, whether not just classes, but the oh boy, it's going decades. I started with my idea, and there it falls apart. But you get berserkers and you get camel classes and so on and so forth, right? You can expect certain things out of certain people groups because these are what were evidenced throughout history. In general, property rights means something, particularly to the English, but then throughout Europe, there's this idea of property rights. And one of the things that we're dealing with now that make all of this an issue is that the timelines have been compressed. And so India, for example, has entered modernity over the past 60 years. And so what took the English 500 years of slow but steady growth, and not only growth but adaptation to, the Indians now are dealing with all of that in a span of 60 years in a single generation. And so you're dealing with the cultural differences, but then you're also dealing with how any culture would come and approach technology, birth control, uh, changing sexual and religious mores. And so all of this is then getting compounded because we also have more or less freedom of movement throughout the world, especially into the countries like England, like Greater Europe, like the US, that have had, again, the Industrial Revolution and the time to adjust to this and figure out how these things are supposed to wash out. And so, right now, we are in this period of great chaos, great malaise, and great transformation. Not necessarily a good kind, but a form of great transformation. And we are trying to figure out how to navigate these waters as best as possible.
Yeah, that just about sums up the state of the world. There is something to be said too. I know this is a totally different topic, but it is one that I like to throw out because I think a lot of people can be very black-pilled by the aspect that travel is so easy and that you can go across the world that simply and then it's hard to leave. But at the same time, it's far easier to go back home now than it ever was before, too. That also kind of gives me some hope is that is like if you think about it, and we could get into a little bit of what Jefferson was talking about or the American Colonization Society, where they wanted to like repatriate free blacks back to Africa, and they gave them a settlement in Liberia. Liberia actually has a very fascinating history that I cannot get into right now. But
Very
anyways,
dark.
it's well, I actually kind of like Liberia in a lot of
Okay.
ways.
It's
There's something
okay.
where I kind of respect them. I can tell you the story of why. What there's a really interesting thing that happened with Liberia, where you had the African National Congress or African National something. It was Marcus Garvey's group, and they had this kind of idea of Liberia as this like almost like a Wakanda, where Liberia was like this never colonized land where slaves became free. And they put together a delegation in the 1930s to go see about resettling more people in Liberia. When they got to Liberia, they were utterly horrified because what they found were the Americo-Liberians were this specific class of people, about 10% of the population,
Right.
who were very well educated, very well off, wore suits, were very, knew all of this history. They had a great deal of respect for America. They named their capital's Monrovia, named after James Monroe. But what they also had were a system of plantations where they had no legal
Yeah.
slavery. However, everyone was essentially a debt slave to the Americo-Liberians, who were the only voting population, who were the only people that were really allowed to do much, who controlled this entire group. So they get there, and it's this like Pan-Africanism group who now walks into like a Netflix adaptation of The Color Purple, where now all of the slave owners are also black. But being like again, I guess a child of the South, there's something where I
Well, it
almost
is
kind
that
of
idea that Tariq Nasheed if he had to go over and stay in Africa, do you really think it's going to be this beautiful, hey, we're all African thing? No. He's going to go over there, and as best he can, he's going to exercise his American ambition in the ways in which he's seen things go on.
Yeah.
And it's both an expression of biospirit as well as externalities that his lineage has gone through up until that point.
Yeah. But all that to say that Liberia has a very fascinating history that most people only know about it when it collapsed and how terrible it is. And they usually point to it as, look, they had the same constitution as us, almost identical. Look at where they're at now. But they had a very fascinating society prior to that. That's mainly it. There were studying simply on that aspect because they were actually very successful. People would find the way that they were successful very
Abhorrent.
dark, abhorrent.
Right.
And there's even ways where even I think that this might be a little abhorrent how they were. But it is fascinating just to look at.
And that does get into the fifth grade argument. You know, it, and it's funny too because people always wash this away, but I mean, really, the crux of it to some degree is, but if the whole continent of Africa was filled with Africans, how did we get slaves?
Yeah, if you want to get into that one, that's also a very fascinating bit of history of how we got slaves from Africa. Because if you watch like Roots, you think that they like ran around with nets and just captured them. No, they just showed up to a port. And one of the very fascinating things is that the two main things that they wanted in trade for slaves were guns and liquor, which you might see some parallels in today. But that was the main thing that they traded. They were warring groups who took these people. The really interesting bit of it is that we outlawed slavery and the international slave trade all across both America, Britain, Europe, and they very
the
much
transatlantic.
the transatlantic slave trade, at least, of purchasing them from Africa. The African kingdoms that were selling these slaves were utterly rebellious against it, were trying to still smuggle them out, hated this, did not want it to be ended. There were wars fought to end slavery for them.
Yeah.
Now, there were other objectives too, but that was one of the things that they were trying to do.
So, and I do want to say that, and it's easy for us as Europeans to recognize this because we've brought this point up multiple times tonight. Just because your forefathers were so and so, now you and I would make the argument that you have a responsibility to acknowledge who your forefathers were, and frankly, to attempt to reach similar heights. But there's also this recognition. It's not completely determinative, and it's not okay. Let's get. Are you're familiar with Emmett Till and all that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
Okay.
Do you want to know the actual story of Emmett Till? Is that something I could tell?
Well, you're aware of his father?
Yeah, Lewis Till. Yeah, Lewis Till. So, yeah, go ahead. I'll let you.
Here we go. Okay. So Lewis Till had a particular predilection to enjoying women, to the point that during World War II, he was was it death by hanging or firing squad?
It was death by hanging. He was hung. He was also only in the army because it was either go to prison for domestic violence or join the military.
Yes. Now, under the army's jurisdiction, he was hung for raping European women. Now, when we get to his son, it's the question of, does the apple fall far from the tree, or did he have the ability to do otherwise?
Well, my argument, also phrase it as, did the apple hang far from the tree?
We could. Ultimately, he did not. But the argument in fairness would be that he could have chosen to do otherwise, and he did not. And so when you start seeing HBD, excuse me, when you start seeing human biodiversity, when you start seeing um, externalities playing an impact, and when you start seeing biospirit on display, this is very much a clue and an invitation to explore greater people groups. And one of the things that you will find too is that um, in general, it sucks to suck. If you are the conquered son of conquered sons of conquered sons, you're probably going to continue to be a conquered son. And that doesn't feel good, but it is what it is. And so, what I don't want to do though is I don't want to take the things are often divided by a matter of degrees. And so, I don't want to come in with the liberal argument that everybody's an individual, man. Well, sure, but you have a history. I also don't I also want to make sure that when I talk about biospirit, one, that if you are seeking to achieve the same heights as your ancestors, that you're actually seeking to achieve it. You don't rest on your laurels and say, because of my ancestors, I am great. And then I do also want there to be this idea that Emmett Till could have chosen to act otherwise.
Yeah,
And so
and
there is this part of humanity that says we could do otherwise. We don't
no,
have to act in sin.
yeah, 100%. And the other thing too is you cannot rest on your laurels simply because you have some greater standing or greater aspect to you, because I mean, I think that this is very clear if you read the biblical narrative. Like, there's a reason why in Chronicles and Kings it is specifically refers first to the king. How did the king do? Was the king walking in the way of the Lord, or was he
Yeah.
evil in his sight? Because the king is judged to a higher degree than those who are of lower status, of lower stature. There's something to be said too here where, and this is really huge to get, especially for Christianity, to understand this, because people who are, like you said, mentally deficient, I've ran into a lot of people. I speak to pagans, to all kinds, where they will say that races and the fact that different races have different average IQs should be like the deathbed of Christianity, because how could they all understand at that level? Well, here's the thing. We've had people that have, mental deficiencies have existed the entire time that Christianity has been around. They have been understood, they've been recognized. And what it comes down to, and what you have to understand, is that, for example, like someone with Down syndrome, though he might not be able to articulate, for example, the meanings of the Westminster Confession or something else, or any of these bigger things, they are still able to be, a saved, believing Christian, because it doesn't come down to exactly what you think and believe and hold to if you can say these things. It is about a love. And you can recognize this too in your children. If you're someone who has children, like the moment you have, like, you can tell that an infant loves you, right? That they have a love for you, even though they can't articulate it, they can't say a word. There is a love that is present there. And if what we are called to do is to love God, love neighbor, there is something to be said where people who don't necessarily have the greater degrees of faculty, or don't have the greater degrees of understanding, or are a part of a civilization that doesn't reach the same heights as others, they still have that capacity, even if they don't hold to the same standards, because none of us are held to the same standards. We are, in the sense that we are asked to go to these things, but all of us are asked to love God, love our neighbor. But what is expected out of you as far as that goes does change depending on how much you are able to understand, how much you've been given. To whom has been given much, much is expected. There's more that is expected out of you the more you have.
So, and this also, now this one I'm getting a little bit far afield of the Bible, but I don't think I'm contradicting the scriptures in saying this. And so it's, well, at what point then? What's the least common denominator? And it more or less the Ten Commandments, and it's the idea, like you just said, the two great commandments being love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and then the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so in that, the atheist and in various people groups, well, I don't need Christianity to tell me that these things are wrong, and I agree with them. I don't think they do, and the reason being, when we were created in the image of God, and there are ways of acting that are obviously against God, whether it be, well, fill in the blank. Obviously, you guys are aware, but murder is an easy one. Okay, so we know that, and we will define murder differently sometimes, but the idea of murder itself is universally abhorrent. And so I totally got lost.
You're
I don't know
fine.
where I was
I
going
could
with that.
maybe pick up a little bit because I think that there's something to be said too about, again, I think this term that you've come to, biospirit, has a lot to it that should be understood and recognized, because I think you're hitting on something very huge, which is, again, I also talk to people who are atheists, but they're on the right. And a lot of these people will focus only on bio. Like they think that it's
Yep.
purely about a bloodline, that that's the only thing that matters, that that's all that
Right.
there is. And I think that you're mistaking so much when you do that, because it is not simply a biological thing. There is more to it than pure biology. And if I could, you really can't have any kind of meaning when, especially as we're talking narratives, like there's no real way to truly get to a sense of meaning that actually makes sense and is consistent if all you have is biology. Because at that
Yeah.
point you're just taking these subjective ideas of, oh well, intelligence, oh well, this, well, if you're literally just a sentient bag of meat that is on a planet that is spinning around, that is just simply out there in existence, how can you have any transcendent meaning over anything? How could any of these things even matter to begin with? You aren't able to ground it. You have this circular reasoning where it's just, well, it matters because it matters to me, because it clearly means
Yes.
something. That's all you end up with. You have to have something that is transcendent over you, and especially as a man, as a created being, as something that is a creature, you have a recognition that there must be something that is greater than yourself. And that's also where you, if you can get into like a conquered people or people that are in lower statuses, even the greatest of men is still, nothing compared to the creator that made him. You are still recognizing your place in that sense has a great degree of value in giving you meaning, giving you understanding, helping you to recognize your place in things, and that regardless of whether you were given much or given very little, you steward what you do have.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and there is a great freedom in that. To in general, I appreciate much of what he said. Uh, but what I'm about to say is very boomer coded. But I think again the principle applies. I remember Sproul talking, and it's this idea that we sort of exist on a spectrum, and what that means is that we take the worst person in the world. So here comes the boomer code. And we can all sort of agree that Adolf Hitler is the worst person in the world. So he's over here on the left side of the spectrum. And we'll go with, oh, it's a hard choice, but say the Apostle Paul. And he's over here on the right side of the spectrum. And so here's the worst human and the best human. And we're somewhere in between these two guys. And we could get pretty close to the Apostle Paul, and we could be high fiving and feeling pretty good about ourselves. But then the spectrum zooms out, and it's like, it's Hitler on the left, it's the Apostle Paul a little bit to the right, and then way down over here on the other side, it's Christ on the right hand side. And so it's just this idea of where we are in history and where we are, frankly, in sanctification and glorification, theosis, as the Orthodox would refer to it, is very, very far apart yet still from Christ. And so it's just good perspective.
Yeah, no, and I think you should have that perspective because I think if you, again, focus far too much on the biology and if you elevate yourself too highly, you are ultimately a finite being. And it's also why
Right.
I
Well,
think that
in
no better philosophy has ever been written than Ecclesiastes. But go ahead with what you're saying.
well, I was thinking, and that is also sort of that's what plays into the whole idea of heritage Americans or of Deutschland den Deutschen, and this idea that I'm not looking for anybody else's bad, but I am looking for the good of my people. I'm looking for the good of my nation. I'm looking for the good of those that are closest to me. And so I don't want this necessarily at the expense of others, but I'm also not going to take food out of my family's mouth to make sure that you don't starve.
Yeah.
There is a hierarchy of concern.
Yeah, the Ordo Amoris, as I think I might have mentioned
Yes.
earlier, is something that needs to be reapplied, and it's a really sad and pathetic state where, especially, you'll find in a lot of evangelical churches that mean well, but these people are so misguided on this aspect in particular, where they think that like the greatest thing they could do is go find a mission in Botswana or they have I don't know if you remember this, the little like pictures of like here's this African kid that you're feeding and you put them up on your refrigerator. My like I've seen those before, but it's like ultimately the people that are actually around you and that are closer to you are the ones that you are to care more about. I mean, it's something that I think people miss a lot with the um with the Samaritan, for example. Like the story of that isn't um everyone is totally your neighbor, everyone's completely there. The Samaritan is used as an example to show look at how horribly these guys have failed to do something for their kin and their closer people. And this guy who is outside of it has done better than them. And he is
Yep.
also doing it with someone that he comes across in his life that he is actively living.
Well, and that's it always, and yes, scripture interprets scripture, blah blah blah. However, or not, I shouldn't say however, but still, 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 8. But if any provide not for his own, and specially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel.
There's a lot of pastors who, especially given that Timothy is particularly saying this to pastors, there are a lot of pastors who neglect their own families. It's why like the pastor's kid stereotype
Ooh,
becomes a
ooh.
because
now,
they
now
think that
you're
they
getting
owe more
into
to the flock
a
than
spicy
to their
one.
own children. Like it exists for a reason. It's not all of
Okay.
them by any means. But I think that that exists as a stereotype and something that's been used to hit because there are pastors who care more about the congregation than they do their own family and they neglect these things. Would you agree, or
Oof.
am I off base on this?
No, 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 no. I don't think you're off base, but I do think what's interesting is uh, how material this can be, and material in that one it's applicable, but material as well. There was in the 20th century, maybe it was the same way, in the 18th and 19th, but for sure in the 20th century, up until we'll say roughly the 90s, but people were still dealing with it at the beginning of the 21st century, where there was almost an expectation, especially within lower churches, that the pastor should be driving the worst vehicle and that the pastor's children should be willing to do without. And that sometimes meant do without their father, and it sometimes meant do without uh, well, college or luxuries or whatever. Now, that was being addressed, certainly. A lot of evangelical universities had PK spot. PK scholarships, so pastors' kids scholarships, and would enable them. This was being addressed in different ways, but I do think there was an expectation that the pastor should have the least and give the most. and that became a very ugly existence for many a pastor's child and a pastor's wife
Oh,
and the pastor
100%.
himself.
And you're
So,
hitting something that I think translates to much of this, which is that idea of, giving more to others or doing things like that, not taking care of your own home
yeah,
first is really at the core of so many of these things, of where you see these things go wrong and where you see, very evil things occurring because people care vastly more about these people that are across the world that might have some bad things. Therefore, you bring them in. And here's the other aspect of all of this is that you're not it's never an individualistic thing when this happens. If you're a pastor who is completely unmarried and has no children, that's one thing to go
yeah,
without. But the second you have a wife that you are, bonded to above your children, that's the other thing, is that a lot of them don't understand this. And even most people don't understand this, but you are to care more about your wife than your kids. Most people care more about their kids than their wife. Your wife is meant to be there for the entirety of your life. It's death to you apart. Kids, 18, 19, 20, at some point they leave the home, they go have a new family. You
mhm,
are supposed to have a greater bond there than any other bond. Losing that, if anything, is why marriage is going so astray in so many different ways. But when you to say more on the just the topic of caring more about others in that aspect, when you have people who decide that even though I have these bonds and these obligations and these responsibilities to me that are dependent on me and that care about me, but I'm going to give more to others and that causes them suffering, that is a great evil. That is the exact evil that is being talked about in First Timothy that you brought up. And that is what undergirds so much of our society. Like the most common thing that I think leftists talk about when they talk about Jesus and the socialist Jesus is, oh, we should have these programs that help all of these people. And why aren't you giving more? Why aren't you doing more? Why don't you pay more to taxes to these programs? Well, that's taking from individuals who ought to have some degree of responsibility and acceptance over that. Now you're actually taking away from them to try and help others. And through doing so, I think that is actually a pretty bad thing to do. It's not the same thing as when you take what you have and with your own means and with respect to those who are closest to you to help those who are closest to you. That is the ideal, not to take and then to just redistribute all throughout. It's a very different thing. It's not the same thing at all. What,
yeah.
what are your
Well,
thoughts on that one?
I think it is interesting how much tension there is um, in doing the right thing, and ultimately, and maybe it's a cop out on my part, but it is sort of that sometimes the right choice is so hidden, or frankly, I'm convinced that there isn't a right choice. And so what happens then is that it reaffirms the fall, and it reaffirms the need for Christ and for God because of how messed up uh, the world and the situations we can find ourselves in is and are. The other part about that though is that it's interesting to me that nobody would say that we should sin that God might be glorified. And so the common one, I'm just going to assume that most of y'all have heard about flirty fishing or whatever. I forget which cult it was that was doing
Oh
that
my,
one.
yeah, that's
But
a crazy blast that you just brought in. I
right,
forget.
so,
I know exactly the cult. I'm blanking on the name, but they were
uh,
insane. Like the things that they would get up to. If
I
you want to
can't
explain
I
flirty
can't remember if
fish,
it was
I
Children of
think it was
God, or who it was.
it was probably Children of God. I think there's multiple
Okay.
cults named that, but
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the idea is that, yeah, you're basically headed towards becoming friends with benefits to get people into the church.
yeah, no,
And
and
we would
that's
all
literally what they would do. It's insane. They would send girls out to go sleep with guys because they had justified it as this is the way to actually get them there,
yeah.
and then bring them in after you do that, and that's what they called flirty fishing. It is
So
it is wild.
and we can see that, and we recognize that that's absurd. That's not honoring to God. What we have a much harder time seeing is putting our household putting our household in pain as sin, and so we justify we sort of justify this left-handed view or whatever, and saying, well, I'm making sacrifices, and I am willing to say that it can be a little bit opaque in these, but I guess where I'm headed is that these sacrifices should be the exception, not the rule. It should be the exception that we say, okay, guys, on Christmas morning or Christmas Eve, we're going to go help at the food kitchen. We're going to go to the nursing home. We're going to make these sacrifices to make sure that other people are cared for. But when that becomes the norm rather than the exception, I do think that's an issue. And frankly, I do think you can absolutely fall into sin in in a uh, in a holy manner. Now, this is also the examples I'm giving are assuming that the person doing this thing is acting from the right motives. 100%, this could be something as simple as, this is getting me more notoriety within the community. This is getting me on more TV spots. This is greasing the tracks for who's that daggum, farts, but the Jewish group that is funding various evangelical churches to put in the different Sunday school curricula. I can't remember off the top of
I
my
have
head.
no idea who you're talking about, so I can't help there. But there is something to be
Yes.
said
The-
where that manner of acting is probably about as close as you can get to Pharisaism as you can.
yes. Yep. Well, and just for a man, again, there's this great tension in that you don't want to turn away a mother who has a starving child. And when Hey Dudes is sending one pair of, was it Hey Dudes? No, it was Tom Shoes or whatever. The one that
I
was
would hope
sending
it's not Hey
over.
Dudes. I actually quite like Hey Dudes. I have no knowledge about them, but I do like to wear them.
No, who was the one that would send a pair of shoes over to
Was that
Africa or
Nike?
Brazil or wherever? No, I think it was Tom's. Anyways,
It doesn't matter.
anyway,
There's a shoe
it
company that
doesn't. It
did
doesn't
this.
matter. There was a shoe company. There was a shoe company that was doing this. I think um, in the early 2000s, but maybe it didn't happen until like the 2010s, whatever. So, anyways, for every pair of shoes you bought, they would send one over to Africa. Oh, okay, yeah. So Witt's jumping in here and saying, yeah, it was Tom's. So where I'm going with that is that these shoes that they're sending over to Africa ultimately are putting the African cobblers out of business, and they're hurting the microeconomies that are in these different areas. When we take rice and send it over to these areas, the farmers can't compete with the rice that USAID and whoever else is sending in there. And so we're destroying the microeconomies.
You're also making them
It's
utterly dependent and taking away any hope that they could
yes.
ever not be dependent because you're literally just handing them things and giving them food, and then they make more people, and then the people need more
Yes.
food, and then yeah, it is why the population of Africa has exploded as much as it has. And nothing has been fixed, nothing has been changed, even though they've gotten more aid. I did a little bit of research on this, but I was looking specifically, and this is where you can like look at aid, right? In the wake of World War II, we had the Marshall Plan and we rebuilt all of these countries. I remember like doing the math for it, adjusted for dollar, right? Because we didn't have to do another Marshall Plan.
Well,
They were able to
Germany
rebuild
kind of
everything.
got the raw deal, but
Germany did, but I think that's your bio talking more than your spirit here. I don't care. I don't
right,
care quite
right.
as much. But yeah, no, and that's also to be said, like, because I think because I'm not German whatsoever and I'm entirely off, like at a certain point, like I kind of just like the British overall, but that's entirely a
As you
separate point.
should.
Yeah. But anyways, where I was actually going with this was that I did the math on it because I wanted to compare the Marshall Plan to how much have we sent to Africa over the course of the time. And it was, I believe it was nearly a dozen Marshall Plans adjusted for inflation that have been sent to the entirety of Africa if you take all of the aid that has gone there versus what it took to rebuild the entirety of Europe after World War II. And nothing has come from it. I think one of the best documentaries. Have you ever seen Empire of Dust?
No.
Have you seen the Asian man saying it's also tiresome?
Oh, okay. Yes. I need to watch this. Yes.
It's incredible. It's one of the greatest watches that you can have, but it's the Chinese trying to get the Africans to become somewhat industrious, and it's incredible because the entire movie is the struggle of a Chinese businessman to get gravel to build a road in a country that has been reduced to rubble, and how utterly difficult and monumental a task it is to get one truckload of gravel from one location to another, and all the different things that they run into, all the different issues. But there's something to be said where this Chinese businessman who is just trying to build this thing out and working with these Africans and to actually like build some infrastructure to then accomplish things. And as horrific as the Chinese tend to be, there is more love and more benefit for the Africans and what they're doing than what we have done in giving them aid. Because at a minimum, they are actually building these things. They have a company that is working through this, that is employing people, that is trying to make a thing happen that actually then builds further infrastructure, which then plays into also, I would argue that colonialism was far
That's
kinder
yeah.
and far better for them than anything that we've done with aid since.
That's actually where I was going to head. There has, and forgive me because any of the particular voices slips my mind right now, but there were post-colonial voices, particularly in India, that said, "Hold on, like the English came in and they were doing something pretty good, and they were teaching us how to use this stuff, how to employ it, and how to do these things. And if we're going to complain at this point about colonialism, what we should be complaining about is that we did not keep up with the trains, that we did not keep up with the infrastructure that had been laid."
Yeah, and I completely agree. And if there was a way for that to become the prevailing narrative and the prevailing voice, that would actually probably solve a lot of problems. It's up to them to figure it out how to do that. But when you
Well, and
simply, yeah,
there is a part of me. This is where sort of the line gets sticky for me, where at the same time, I almost don't care if they do that or don't do that.
yeah, I mean,
I do
there's,
well there, and you there is a left wing argument in there that I try to avoid, where it's they go beyond and say, well, all cultures are equal, man. And that's not quite what I'm saying, but what I am saying is, look, if they're not out there,
I get what you're saying. If you
there's a
want me to
word.
try
What's
to
that?
articulate it. I might be able to articulate what you mean, which is that Europeans might have been meant to make steam trains and airplanes and, explore continents. And some groups of people might have just been meant to be happy in a hut with, fire and clothes.
Right. Well, yes. And what I got hung up on is trying to find a word for RAPE without saying a fruit, because I get tired of
Not
hearing of the fruit. But
non-consensual
yes,
relations.
right. So as long I do want them to avoid non-consensual relationships with people. At the same time, dude, if they just want to jam in a hut, yeah, I'm pretty okay with that. Um,
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
not
like, do we need to change them? If that
right.
is yeah, no, I'm 100% on board with you on that one. Like, we don't need to elevate these people if they
Well,
are happy and relatively content in their state of being. Let the Western man be the Western man. Let the African man be the African man.
there is the principle of sin, and that we all have to recognize sin. But after we recognize sin, and after we recognize our place, and whether we want to phrase it the great chain of being, or whether we want to just our place under God, uh, how we interact with the world after that, and how we display our culture, I don't really care.
Yeah,
But don't expect me at that point to, well, frankly, it is a weird form of colonialism that we go into a place and say you have to be this.
yeah, I mean, it is, and it's like the worst form of it, I think, is like whatever we've been trying to do for the last several decades, where it's like you have to be a liberal democracy because like the previous forms of
Goodness.
colonialism, like we didn't care as much about like what you actually did. It
Yeah.
was more or less like a we just wanted to like, well, hey, you want to have Rajas? Cool, you're gonna have Rajas, but also we want to build some tea plantations and we want to get some shipping done.
Yeah.
That is far better than we want you to be able to have feminism and women's studies, and we want you to have everyone voting,
I was
and
going to
you are,
say,
yeah,
and have a general suffrage that
yes,
uh,
exactly. So
how do we go into good night? How do we go into Iraq and Afghanistan and say
you're
that the
getting
guy,
flashbacks back to that.
dude, I'm just remembering Bedouins. It was straight biblical.
Oh yeah,
And
the dudes on
we're
camels
out
for
there.
nomadic, and yeah.
Yeah, and we're out there and we're scanning this dude's cornea, or what, I forget which system we were using, and his daughters are all veiled up, and it's like, what are we doing? And this guy who is worried about his sheep whether his sheep mounted the rest of the ewes, or whether they fell into a river or whatever, and it's like, yeah, and you're going to vote for who your next president is, somebody that he hasn't even seen because he doesn't even have any form of electricity.
And he also cares nothing about, because that doesn't matter
No.
compared to does my
Why
sheep
would it?
fall into the river. This is something that we care about. It's not something that they necessarily care about. We don't have to make them care about it.
Oh man. Yeah, well, and so that's an interesting point too. Should they care about it? They don't. So why should they?
Yeah, what is the actual value to it? Like we see, and that's the other thing. Because I think that you could see like there's a spirit to that, where I think that that has been
Yeah.
in past times. I think that that is beneficial, and I would even go so far as to say I think that between 1789 and 1865, I think that, or 1860, this was probably one of the greatest countries and experiments that had ever been enacted. And I think experiment even goes too far, but the way that people lived and how they had and what they were doing and the elevation of man and how we had expanded across, all under this, this idea of different, of some level of like a democratic republic, was
Yeah.
extremely beneficial. But then we take the idea that because it was very beneficial, we project that onto the democratic republic and the idea, and we lose the fact that it was our people who were doing this, and it was
Yes.
our unique people who were capable of this. The things go together. The reason why this thing worked for us and what it's an outgrowth out of is our particular people.
Yep.
These things work for us because they come from us. It doesn't work when you put it, just slap it onto someone else. Because like again, just if you just study English history, you will see the through line into America of why we have the things that we have, that it did not come out of the aether in 1776, and that it was not something that was very unique in maybe a way that the French Revolution might have been, but it was mostly an outgrowth of how we had been living, how we had understood things, what had transpired in settling this land, how we had, in a lot of ways, you could almost say like a Darwinian aspect where it was a
If
great
they were
degree of,
going
yeah.
to do it, if they were
Mhm.
going to do it, they would have done it.
Yeah, well, that too. Yeah, if they were gonna do it, then yeah, they would have actually cared about it. They would have learned it. They would have tried to adopt it. And there's something to be said about Japan, for example. Like Japan is one of the
Mhm.
great success stories, you could say, of modernization, where they went very quickly into this. And even though there were some insane wars that occurred over this that were absolutely brutal and
Yeah.
caused strife, but those were done with in about a generation. And after
Yeah.
that, they quickly elevated themselves and they have been more or less able to operate with these systems and with these things. I think that they have lost some things. I think they kind of need like that
Well,
spirit of the samurai needs to kind of come back to some degree to them. I think that would do them a lot of good if they can actually somehow bring
they're
that back.
missing their Cavaliers.
Yes, exactly. They're missing their Cavaliers.
Yeah. Well, and that does get into all sorts of things.
I love,
Um,
yeah. I mean, well, the Cavalier
as
Puritan thing, I think, is also very tired as far as the narrative goes. To be honest,
you were hitting that big a few weeks ago, weren't you?
yeah. A few weeks ago, I was talking about
Yeah.
this where a good friend of mine, someone that I really like, Will Tanner, and he puts out some great stuff. I've been on his show, and I've met him.
Yeah.
Um, but he is very big on, like, he calls it the Puritan War of Aggression and all these other things. And it's like, look, the way, and this is what I wrote, one of my favorite articles that I ever made was "The South Will Rise Again," but the way that I had described it and what I had outlined here is a sort of two founding thesis of America, where you had the Puritans in the North, you had the Cavaliers in the South, and these, from these two people come the American spirit. And you see more of it in the Northern peoples. Saw more of the Cavalier and more of this Southern aspect to, the South, that they are have these differences, but that when they come together and that they're able to have that actually gets you the best working relationship. And I would say that where you have one sort to die down, that's when things go bad. And I think the South is where you have, we are the firstborn son of America that is also, I think, in a lot of ways been dispossessed of our inheritance, where it's the South that America has originated from. It's the South that started this. It was Jamestown. We were, for, Virginia was the core of this country for a large period of its time. It's where so many of the greatest men have come from, and that also translates out to all these other states and all the spirit that's here. And I would also say that Southerners have a better grasp of how to navigate the current world than most people do, in part because we have lived in a, you could say, diverse environment around people who are different than us for longer than, say, Midwest Germans, who probably never saw anyone that was, even slightly tawny the entirety of their lives and are now having Haitians dropped on them. Well, we've been living among Africans for pretty much the entire time that we've been here. So we kind of have a grasp on these things. We can pull more
But
of
that
it. I
doesn't
think we have a
sound
greater
pleasant at
understanding.
all. You're not
It doesn't
really
sound
making
what?
that doesn't sound pleasant at all. Why would
Oh,
I
it's
want
not
that?
pleasant, but we at least understand how to navigate it. That's what I mean. It's not
Mm.
to say that, like, this is how we ought to live, but it's how we are. It's the reality of the situation as it is, and you can learn some things from it and at least how to navigate it. Ideally, to make it so we don't have to deal with it. But the fact that we
It is.
understood, does that make sense? Do you get what I'm saying?
Uh, well, so I'm trying to think about this. There was, and I change my theses all the time, right? Like you get 5 years down the road, and it's like, maybe I need to shift that a little bit. But there was a time where I was like, if the great man comes, if there's going to be great men in the U.S., and if there is going to be a particular great man, he will come from the Midwest. Reason being is because he can remember a time when he didn't have to live this way.
I would say the opposite is, I think
Right.
that the great man would come from the one who has understood this and has some connection to it and therefore knows how to navigate the situation far better.
Mm. But he's been. I don't know. It will be interesting to see.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, what we'll see whatever whenever the
Yeah.
great man arrives, we'll see where he
If he
comes from.
does, right?
If he
If he
does. I mean,
does.
either God will give him to us or he will not come, but ours is to simply make as much as we can for him, shape the nation and do what we can with the station that we have in order to build
Yeah.
things out to be a little bit better, to hopefully
I've
prepare
always
things for it.
it's interesting too, because and this is really getting into the woods, but I've always found Appalachians different than Southerners.
Appalachians are different. I mean, they are different to a degree ethnically, but any
Right.
people that live in the mountains generally tend to be different than people who live in lowlands.
Yep. And I have found that for myself, boy, now I'm really giving away the game to some degree. I found that for myself, I generally work better with Appalachians than I do Southerners.
That's fair. I work better with Southerners than I do Appalachians.
So interesting. Why is it, you think?
I
Actually,
think
you don't have to answer that because now we're getting into specifics about various
I
folks.
wouldn't give
So,
away the game on it. I mean, the easiest way is just like that's my people were not Appalachians. My people
mm.
settled in relatively in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, and they never really ventured out into that. And I think that that translates into like what people I tend to do better around. And I would imagine you might have Appalachian lineage to some degree. Is that accurate
It's
or no?
complicated.
Oh
It's
yeah, well yeah,
complicated.
you have the German half, but either way, yeah, the mountainous people tend to be different. That's the biggest thing. But I
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that in the South, the Southern spirit in particular has an understanding of these hierarchies, of these differences. I think also of there's a higher degree where I mean you can see it now. It's the bulwark where the right mainly is it's in the South and it's in the Midwest, but the South has been there. And I think also the fact here's the other aspect. The South has survived at this point, I would argue, three reconstructions against it and is still going. You had the
Go on.
first what?
Oh, I said go on. I didn't know you were
Yes.
going to say, yeah, I want to hear it.
So you have the first reconstruction, which occurred, after the end of the Civil War. And we came out of that and I would say that we might have lost the Civil War, but we won Reconstruction. We came out of that. The radical Republicans did not achieve what they wanted. We regained control over the South. We coalesced around it. You had, again, like the lost cause was the prevailing narrative and understanding throughout the country. And on top of that, more people do care about the Confederate story is objectively vastly superior to the Union story and as a narrative. And it's what more people cared about, what more people romanticize. I think far more people can
Well, of
romanticize.
course they would romanticize it because it was, we love David and Goliath. We love
Yeah,
a
an
long
underdog
shot.
story, even if an underdog
Right.
loses. But it's also, I think the spirit of it too, of like where you have got like Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and all of
Mm.
these different figures, I think have more to them in what they were actually trying to achieve and more that's in line than I think necessarily the Union does. And I don't hate the Union by any means. I'm not going to bash
then
them.
then a drunk
Yeah, then
then
a
a drunk
drunk
from
and a
Ohio.
guy who burned all the like that's their two big guys.
Well,
Also,
yeah, right. Go ahead.
I was going to say you also do have Custer, who was I would argue the Northern Cavalier, who actually did have a pretty good military
You
career.
know
And
why?
why? Why would you say that?
Because he had his German side.
Oh, fair. But
So, but that, and then I will say, I've always had a soft spot for Dagum Chamberlain.
yeah, that's fair. Chamberlain, yeah, I can give that.
Be,
Anyways,
because the
yeah,
the problem with the North is it. I was gonna say at least how history books, but it's not even how history books present it. It is a fact that these were guys who were focused on ruthless efficiency more than they were any sort of higher idea, higher
Yeah.
ideal that they were chasing. And so even though you can find faults, and even that's kind of a funny word, but you could argue that there were faults within the greater ideologies that were being held to in the South. At least they were fighting for something more than the machine.
Yeah, and exactly. Like there was an idealism that ran through the South versus the North for the most part. Their argument was simply, well, this doesn't make sense for us to split, therefore we must take it back and we must continue this project versus the South has much more.
Although,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna get strung out for this one. I think that perhaps you could make the argument that Lincoln was more ideological than the average Union soldier.
Well, I mean, if you're talking the average Union soldier, the average might have been a guy from Ireland or from Germany who just showed up, but that's a
That's not
complete.
true. That's not true. There
They
was
had a
no
higher.
more there was no more than 25% Germans. And to get to that, you have to be counting Custer as German.
Okay, but you also had the Irish, and you they listen. Okay, we
Okay,
could we
we'll
could
we'll
we could
both
have an haw
we'll both
about it.
piss on the Irish.
Well, we could have an haw about it, but either way, like there was
It
vastly
was an
more immigrants.
Anglo war.
Yeah,
It was an Anglo war.
an Anglo War where one side brought in a bunch of Irish and German mercenaries. Yes, but
Okay.
but I mean, they ultimately won, so I have to accept that. But to get back to the actual what I'm trying to say with this reconstruction, the
Yeah.
lost cause
Oh
was the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
prevailing. You had the Confederate monuments that were built, but I would argue that in the 1960s, you had a second reconstruction which occurred, which is the
Okay.
imposition of the Civil Rights Act, of desegregation, of all these things. It is a reconstruction of Southern society. And the Southern man still persisted beyond that. And then now, when you had the BLM riots, that was a third reconstruction because it was primarily targeted, though it hit the whole country, was where you had Robert E. Lee's statues melted to the ground, where you had all these monuments removed, where you annihilated Monument Avenue and all of these places. And Monticello gets completely redesigned to be all about Sally Hemings, and all of these things happen. Every Confederate museum you go to is now about how evil my people were, versus before it was not
Did
that.
you this is neither here nor there, but did you get to see Monument Avenue before all that?
Sadly, no. I'm very sad that I did not. But here's the thing, that image of Robert E. Lee's statue melting, literally, it runs through the core of us vastly more than I think it does a Midwesterner. And I think that that visage of just this burning, melting thing of one of our greatest heroes just being annihilated, of even his horse doesn't get to be left alone. I think that that hits us more with how horrible and evil this project has been. And I think that that is then able to coalesce into more of, I think that that means that we're the place where this comes from. And here's what I would also say is that as we start to get into more of like what an American is, I would say that the white population of the United States, the heritage American population, continually is adopting Southern characteristics and has been for quite some time, where country music pervades, where you can find guys in Ariat boots all over, belt buckles, flannels, like the aspects of our culture that are easily adopted are more being adopted. And
Ariats are Chinese. Double
whatever.
H are from Pennsylvania.
Okay. Either way, cowboy boots, square toes are associated with us. That's all I'm trying to get at. That's my main point. But I'm
Yeah.
sure you saw this in the Army, like, or in the Marine Corps, where you have, like, would you not say? I think that to a degree, guys just kind of start to become more Southern when they're in the military. Where, for example, chewing tobacco is a Southern thing, and then it becomes a military thing to be able to do that. Where you have more guys that are adopting some of these things, or dressing like this, or acting more like that. And I think that's also where the martial culture more or less was, more so than it was anywhere else. What do you think? Is there some truth in that?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is um, potentially yes, but part of that is the overwhelming amount of infantry training schools and infantry forces within the U.S. are located south of the Mason-Dixon line, and so I don't know. I don't know if it's the military itself as much as it is that's what they're living and breathing. If they are in actual oh, now I'm really pissing off the military guys. If they're in combat MOSs, then yes, they're generally going to be south of the Mason Dixon line. I'm trying to think honestly of okay, so Ohio has a reserve unit of Marine Corps infantry.
Well, you
Where's
got
Drum?
Pendleton, right?
Well,
Drum's in New
yeah, but I
York.
mean that. Yeah. So is there infantry up at Drum? Can't
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
remember.
That's where 10th Mountain is.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we've got those. We've got two of them so far,
Well,
but
there's the ones I
Lejeune,
could name the army
what's
bases.
that?
I could name the army bases really quick. Like the main ones where
I
you have
would.
infantrymen, you got Kansas, where First ID is, you got JBLM, you got an infantry unit
Okay.
that's over there. There's a few that are outside, but for the most part, yes, the majority of our infantry is somewhere south.
Yeah, I was gonna say Benning. Benning is the big one, and then you've
Well,
got
that's where
Bragg, and
every
then
infantryman goes to learn to be an
right.
infantryman.
Yep, you've got Bragg. I think 101st is at Campbell. I think,
Yep,
which is
Campbell's
down in
Tennessee, and it's
yeah,
on the other. It's split across both borders.
yeah, between Tennessee and Kentucky, and then you know, in Florida it gets weird however we want to count it, but I'd probably say Pensacola. Pensacola is among the most southern portions of Florida, southern proper versus
Well, yeah,
Miami or whatever.
North Florida is
So
southern proper.
right,
Oh,
yeah.
this is actually a
So
good point. Do you know where the Bonnie blue flag came from?
mm,
This is just an interesting, just fun little historical tidbit as we reach the 2 hour and 10-minute mark. But the Bonnie blue flag actually originates from West Florida when West Florida had rebelled under James Madison because a bunch of American settlers went into this territory and then started a this is the republic that everyone forgets about because everyone knows that California was its own republic. Everyone knows that Texas was, but West Florida was a short-lived 7 week long republic, and their flag was a big blue black big blue background with a
yeah.
single white star, which would later be adopted by the Confederacy as one of its many flags. So there you go. That's a little more Southern history.
Yeah. So, and I think, the going back to what you were saying, the argument sometimes is, oh, it's all Scots Irish in the military. Well, that wasn't my experience, but whatever. I'll let it roll. Slash, yeah, the overwhelming majority of infantry places within the military are south of the Mason Dixon line. However, that would also play into what we've been talking about for the past couple hours, in the idea that biospirit isn't just what's actually inside of the person, but it's also related to their particular externalities and how they interacted with them. So that was a long way of explaining it snows up north. In general, you're not going to keep infantry battalions up there because you want to be able to move them very quickly. And you're going to be able to move them less quickly when they're in the snow. And so, yeah, even if you go to continental Germany and whatever, they're routinely surrounded. That was an issue coming up with World War I, and why they were getting frustrated at the various different world powers, and they were trying to establish themselves as a world power. But one of the things that they're dealing with throughout history is it snows. there comes a season where the fighting has to be put to the side because you have to make sure that you can continue on through the winter. And so that plays into the fact that in the South, where it snows less, I think you are going to have more opportunities for less lethal martial endeavors. And all I mean by that is that fighting for some people's is fun, and fighting for other people's is a means of accomplishing a particular end.
It can also be both.
It can be both.
Ah,
Yeah.
but so that biospirit thing, I think we've done a pretty good job on covering that. I think I know we've
I hope
meandered
so.
quite a bit. Yeah. I think we've meandered a lot, but I think we did actually. I
Yeah.
hope all of this is interesting.
I think we did. We never did get in even to high and low church. We'll save that for another time because I do think that's an interesting exploration of biospirit as well. I mean, the easy break there is, and we talked about this last week, is the continental versus United Kingdom English break there. I really don't know. What I didn't hit on last week, but I'll touch on it right now real quick, is because of the application of monarchical ideas, and because of the hierarchies of power within the continent, I'm not convinced, I don't think, that anybody other than the English could have come over and created the states. And ultimately, that's how it played out, because we had the Spanish over here, we had the French, and there were a couple of other very small players that wanted to stretch their arms out, but ultimately they were unable to in the wake of the English. And I think a big part of that was the English approach to religion and to religious hierarchy.
Oh, well, of course it was. I mean, even just as simple as the fact that the English deciding to even get on the colonization game was, in some parts, counter to the Treaty of Toledo, where you had the Pope split essentially the entire world between Portugal and Spain and decide that this half goes to Spain to colonize, this half goes to Portugal. And they had already been ahead of the game, and so it's this, well, they've already started and we want to contest this alliance and these groups of people. And so we're going to also get in on the colonization game. I mean, it's inherently tied in. It's impossible to separate religion from the founding of the United States. And it's, again, to go back to the very first one, the fact that they have been mostly successful in divorcing religion from America's foundations and who we are as a people, and trying to separate these two things out in this bizarre view of separation of church and state, which they pull from like one letter that Jefferson wrote, not even from the Constitution, shows
Right.
just how
Yeah.
powerful a narrative can be, shows just like what you can do off of a few things to try and get something that might have some level of resonation to then enact what you want, because you can never actually just truly do whatever. That's the other thing to wrap. I guess we could maybe wrap with that, but to go into narratives, you can never actually just do anything purely because you have a position of power. Everything always requires a justification to it. Everything requires some thing behind it to why you're doing something, how you're doing something. Everyone, you're never actually alone, right? Like you always are getting other people to do things and they need a reason why. And that is
Which, yes, that is a narrative, and that's also, and yeah, we'll wrap on this one, to give Dan Carlin his due, because I do think he, regardless of who he is as a person or his politics or whatever, I do think hardcore history was a great thing that he was doing, and precisely because one of the things that he was stressing is that if we're going to go into this, We need to understand these people for what they were saying, not how we're interpreting it, but what their mindset was and what they were accomplishing. And the reason we've been leaving our grand narrative is because everything Kaiser just said about what the forefathers of this nation were accomplishing has been read through the spirit of another people group that frankly couldn't care less about what the fathers intended as long as they can take something out and according to their biospirit push it into something that benefits them, which
Yeah,
frankly to some degree they rightly should according to who they are.
yeah,
But
and
that's not
that's
something that we have to put up with.
no, exactly, and you're completely correct on that. Where it's I think the Scorpion and the Frog is one of the greatest
Oh,
stories of all
yes.
time. It's one
Okay,
of my
good.
absolute favorites. Um, and I could do like an hour about Drive in the movie Drive and why it's actually a very deep movie because it hits on this, but I won't do that for now. We can maybe do that later. But the Scorpion and the Frog in particular, it is in the Scorpion's nature to simply do that. The story is all about the frog. Like the scorpion is not to blame for having stung the frog. It's the fact that the frog thought that the scorpion would act in he knew going into it. This is what you do. The scorpion told him he would not. He picked up the scorpion, he goes across, the scorpion stings him. It's the frog who has had the issue here. That is who it is about. It is not being the frog. You can't change the scorpion. You can decide whether or not you actually go along with it or pretend that someone or something or a group or a civilization does not have the nature that it does and act like they will simply act like a frog when they are in fact a scorpion.
My goodness. Hey, that's a perfect place. Perfect place to end. Where can people find you? What should they be looking forward to? What's what?
Yes. So my main platform is Twitter. I go by Kaiser Lohengramm. The at in the bottom is the at that you would type in to find me. I also host the Green Tavern on YouTube. You can also just find that by searching the Green Tavern. I am one of multiple hosts that is part of the Nathaniel Green Society, which is a project that I'm in, and we are a fraternal Christian heritage society in North Carolina. If you happen to be in North Carolina, come check us out. You can find us just by finding the link in my bio. And we're trying to restore the state of North Carolina in whatever we can. It's the greatest project I've ever been a part of. This is the reason why I'm so white pilled and happy all the time. It's because I get to meet up with patriots who are like minded all the time. We're smart and we actually work towards things. So, yeah, you can find all of that there.
It would have to be a very odd chain of events as well for a person to be depressed in the great state of North Carolina.
I am honestly like as much as we have had horrible things happen here, it is pretty hard to be depressed in North Carolina. It is a beautiful state.
I mean, it's just unbelievable. East to well, I'm the guy that would drop out, Cary, Raleigh, Durham, whatever. But
Charlotte,
I do.
yeah, I mean, you could write off just about every major population center in North Carolina,
I
but
suppose that's most states, but yeah. Very good. All right. Well, hey, I greatly appreciate it.
no
I hope
problem.
for whoever stuck around, this was edifying and a little bit explanatory, or at least gave you something to think about. So with that, you guys take it evening. Take it evening. Take it easy and have a
It's
good
late.
evening. All right, guys. Adios.
Good night.